Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar with SCL Partners and our partners, VoltDB. Today's webinar is titled Making Network Slicing a Reality, How Should Telcos Transform? So we'll be touching a little bit on the network technology that is enabling network slicing, but also focusing a bit more on some of the other IT, orchestration, other enablers that are going to really bring network slicing to life as we move into Release 17 and start to build 5G standalone core, basically. So we will first just go through the housekeeping, as always. If you're new to one of our webinars, please do listen out. So there's a few things. First of all, you are in listen-only mode. So I'm afraid if you have any feedback, if there's any problems you're facing, do type a comment in the chat box and we can get back to you. So things like audio issues, that sort of thing. If you have a question on the content, we will have a Q&A panel at the end. So we would really love to try and answer as many questions as possible in the session. So if you do have a question, please use the question kind of tab for that to submit your question. And you can, direct it to a particular panelist if you prefer, or just keep it general. For any questions we don't get round to answering, we'll be answering them offline and sharing around a document as part of the follow-up materials that we send round. We will also, everyone always, someone has to ask this during the webinar, but as always, we will share the slides and we will share the recording shortly after the session as well. And you are free to share this with colleagues. If you would like to ask a colleague to join the webinar now, I am kind of pleased to say that we are currently on 499 registrants for this webinar. So if we can get that to 500, that would be amazing. And it'd make Dheeraj happy in particular. And finally, if you're on Twitter, then tweet us at sclpartners.com. So let's get started. Before Ria dives in with her presentation, firstly, I'd just like to quickly introduce who's on the webinar today. You've got myself, Dalia, Adib, a director in the consulting team who will be moderating the session today. And you'll kind of mainly hear me pop up at the end in the Q&A. Ria, as I said, is one of our senior consultants, and she will be presenting some of the research findings that we've done with VoltDB recently. You then also have Patrick Montague-Jones, another senior consultant at SCL Partners. He'll be answering some of your questions in the Q&A. And finally, Dheeraj Remella, who's Chief Product Officer at VoltDB, and we are sharing some of Volt's insights around the topic and around Volt's capabilities to bring this to life, plus be answering questions later on in the panel as well. So I think that's it. Without further ado, I guess it's over to you, Ria.
Great, thanks very much, Dalia. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting on the telco monetization opportunity with network slicing. So I'll talk a little bit about, firstly, what slicing actually is and why it's an opportunity for telcos. Also, how telcos can provide slicing solutions to their customers, so what the different options are. Also, how telcos will need to evolve their IT to actually enable this. And then finally, other internal considerations that telcos will need to think about to really prepare for the slicing opportunity. So before diving into that, I just wanted to give a little bit of context as to why we're actually talking about network slicing. And at STL, we've done a lot of work looking at 5G, as well as a number of other emerging technologies that are shaping the telecoms industry. And how we really try to think about this is in terms of what these technologies and opportunities will mean when it comes to redefining the telco proposition and future-proofing their business models. And by that, I mean that telco's main proposition has, historically been connectivity, but value is really shifting to the services that run on top of the network. And so telcos need to think about how they can move up the value chain and take on a bigger role in meeting the evolving needs of customers, particularly in the B2B space, because, there's a lot of sort of value potential there. And when I say sort of, the evolving needs of customers, I mean this, need and desire to become more efficient and more sustainable, and therefore generally more automated and digitized as well. And so 5G is really part of that story. It has a number of capabilities that are better than those of previous generations. It's not just faster, but it offers higher bandwidth, capacity, reliability, etc. And those capabilities also mean that it has the capacity to support a number of new and dynamic use cases. And the ones listed here are just some of the ones that we're hearing about that seem to be gaining more and more traction within the market. But the challenge for telcos is sort of twofold. Firstly, they need to find a way to monetize the investments that they're making in 5G, and that really means thinking about how to monetize the network and these capabilities that we're seeing, but also providing what enterprises really need to benefit from these use cases. And that provides the context for why we're talking about network slicing. So 5G has been architected as cloud native, and that makes for more flexible and customizable networks. And network slicing is really a way to exploit that and the advanced capabilities that 5G brings. So that means being able to meet the requirements of some of these use cases that we are hearing about, and for example, being able to provide assurance to satisfy some of the more stringent SLAs that these applications have. And one thing that's worth noting here is that the timeline for slicing, at least in the way that we're going to discuss it in terms of achieving all of these benefits, the more kind of dynamic slicing that's sort of customizable to meet different customer needs, that will be dependent on the rollout of 5G standalone, which is still likely 2-3 years away. But this is an opportunity to really monetize the network, and there are a number of things that telcos need to think about and plan for now if they want to capture revenue gains here when this becomes sort of more of a defined opportunity. So what do we mean by network slicing? So we define slicing as a way for telcos to create and dynamically manage functionally discrete virtualized end-to-end networks over common infrastructure. So that means that telcos can use the same physical network infrastructure to provide network capabilities that are tailored to meet the specific requirements of a customer or of an application. And that obviously has cost-saving implications, but it also gives and cost-saving implications because it is using that common infrastructure, but it also gives new ways for telcos to monetize their networks and enable these dynamic new applications. So rather than taking a sort of one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to the network, telcos can tailor the network to provide customers with what they need. So, for example, you might have an application in emergency services, which would have requirements around security, perhaps because it'll likely be dealing with sensitive patient data, but also resilience and reliable coverage, especially if it's quite a mission critical application. You'll then also have applications within an industry like mining, for example, which might also require reliability, but also high bandwidth. And in terms of how telcos can actually provide this as a solution to customers, we see different ways for how this could work and how this could be offered to customers. And this is something that telcos need to think about because it will have implications not just on the actual infrastructure, but also on the skills and organization that's required to provide these solutions to customers. So one option that we see could be that a telco has a handful of slices that are tailored to specific optimizations. So for example, there could be one slice optimized for ultra reliable low latency, one optimized for high bandwidth, so that could be to support a number of applications within a manufacturing plant, for example, one for low power devices and so on. And as far as slicing goes, this is one of the simpler options for telcos because they can have multiple customers on just a handful of slices tailored for a specific capability. But this is relatively generic compared to other options that I'll go through, and it may not satisfy all customer needs in the same way as more sort of private options. So there's another option where telcos could have multiple custom instances on this handful of slices. So, each slice instance would be based on the templates from, the last scenario. So structure, configuration, etc. And it's basically using the same recipe as the slices configured for other customers, but it has its own unique slice instance. And then the final option that we sort of have heard about and thought about is this option involving complete customization for specific customers or even specific customer applications. And this would be the most challenging for telcos from actually implementing this sort of way of delivering the solution all the way through to actually maintaining the slice and slice instances. So it would require significant automation and therefore would likely require significant upskilling. But the point here is that it's really important that operators think about these different options, really evaluate, how they might want to offer slicing as a solution to their customers, and also what their customer requirements are. So, do the customers who they want to target or, the industries that they want to target really require a specific level of customization or privacy? And then they need to think about, as the next step, what the requirements are to actually provide that. And a big part of that we've actually spoken to both operators and vendors about this is what the implications are from an IT perspective. So for those of you who joined our previous webinar which was on how IT systems need to evolve for 5G, you should recognise this table that my colleague Patrick showed, and this outlines which IT systems will be most effective by some of these key changes that we've identified that are, really driving the need for telcos to evolve their sort of underlying systems. And you can see that when it comes to network slicing, that will have an impact on a number of these domains. And I'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail. So for any of the three models for slicing that I just laid out, they'll bring in a great deal of complexity to the network. And 5G itself, being cloud native, is more complex than previous generations. It will also already mean more data traveling through the network, so higher volumes of traffic, for example, from IoT applications, and that is an opportunity for operators, but only if they think about how they can actually monetize that. So from a charging perspective, there are challenges in the fact that slicing is not a static product. It is more of a dynamic solution. It's more customizable, and therefore not so straightforward to charge for. So operators need to think about how they might want to actually charge for slicing. Should it be per slice? But then obviously not every single slice is going to be the same. Should it be by device? Should it be based on outcome or service or quality of service provided to customers? Or should it be based on consumption? And then if any of these options are chosen, how do you actually quantify that, especially in a way that provides visibility to customers? And the sort of latest 3GPP standards are factoring in slicing as part of the charging system, but it's important that telcos identify what the charging options are. And that's not just a job for the IT teams, because it will have implications on strategy and product teams as well to really identify how customers might want to consume these services. And then from an infrastructure perspective, what capabilities are required to actually support this. And there will need to be considerations around vendors and partners. So for example, from an infrastructure perspective, how can telcos make sure that they're really exploiting these monetization opportunities? And there will be, with this increase in the amount of data, there will be more monetizable charging events that will need to be processed. And actually, I think that that's something that Dheeraj is going to go into a bit more detail on in his presentation. Another thing that telcos need to think about that sort of leads on from this conversation around charging is the customer experience. And I sort of touched on this a second ago, which is, giving customers the visibility when it comes to the bill that they receive as to, how and why they've been charged what they have. So that will likely require a move away from simply maybe a chunky bill at the end of the month to a more interactive model where enterprises can see at any moment where they are with their spend and why. And another IT system factor that telcos will need to consider is that as they enable these services, especially if they want to move to providing more sort of end-to-end solutions to capture more value, they may have a number of different partners providing different parts of the solution. So, you might have a cloud provider providing the cloud infrastructure, telco providing the connectivity, ISV providing the application, and so on. And so, there's really then a question of how to, split revenues across the different partners involved in providing the solution. And I mean, these are all things that, while the opportunity is still a couple of years off, as I said at the beginning, it really will be worth identifying these challenges now and starting to have conversations with potential partners and vendors, but also internally. So, to help see what the kind of areas of weakness are or potential change are that will be important to evolve in order to actually enable this, and then what the sort of roadmap is and what the next steps are. So I just wanted to share an example here of, how telcos can really benefit with more evolved IT when it comes to slicing. So, telcos can integrate data from the network with other systems to actually enable solutions like slicing. And they can, open up their network functions to internal stakeholders through APIs. And that will allow internal teams who don't usually have visibility over the network to interact with the underlying network functions. And for example, that could allow, product development teams to build new services, including slicing, based on having that enhanced visibility. And that would ensure as well that application KPIs were met by being able to monitor and orchestrate network functions accordingly. But that will require a new way for commercial teams to actually interface with the network. So it will require different tools for the sort of non-network specialists. So new skills as well would be required to actually implement that. So that might mean IT skills for the product teams, or at a minimum, and what we have heard a number of operators sort of moving towards is having more communication between the network and commercial teams. So just to sort of wrap up and summarize, there are a number of considerations for telcos when it comes to preparing to really exploit the slicing opportunity once it does mature, and really drive value from their 5G deployments. So, the first thing is understanding customer demand and, what slicing model telcos might want to deploy depending on what applications or industry verticals they're hoping to address. What internal changes will be required, so from a technology perspective, but also organizationally and financially. So what technical requirements will be needed, what level of upskilling will be required to actually enable and manage these solutions, what sort of needs to be proven to be able to justify the business case internally, what organizational changes could drive value, so for example with more sort of cross-functionality and communication. And finally, which IT system need to evolve and how in order to enable which requirements. So thank you very much for listening. Just a reminder before I hand over to Dheeraj, if you do have any questions for us, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end, as Dalia said, so please do continue to submit as we go through the next presentation as well. So Dheeraj, over to you.
All right, thank you, Ria. Let me just make sure that I have the key control. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, great. Hey, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. So my part of this discussion is around, what is network slicing in terms of like capabilities required, and what are the challenges that are actually that need to be overcome before we can make progress in that, right? So while, as Ria mentioned, it's a couple of years out, the building blocks, the preparatory work that needs to be done, we need to take care of it before we get there, right? So I'm thinking this actually should move to the next slide. All right, it did. Okay. So at Volt, like we split the world into, the major significant event in 5G is 5G, right? So enabling 5G, all the factors and components that you need to work on to make sure the 5G is successful. And once 5G is there, who are the beneficiaries, right? So these are not all inclusive, inclusive of all the tenants, but like more like the key ones, right? So BRAN, CRAN, ORAN, like the RAN component becoming software enabled is a necessary step in that. Converged charging and policy, real-time mediation, these are actually the core BSS functions that you need to have updated and upgraded to a level where they can actually manage the 5G functions and capabilities that are going to be projected into the future. The most important one of them at this juncture is network slicing, right? So when you are going to network slicing, you need to understand how your network is used, so you need the analytics function in place. But all of these things need to be service-based architecture and cloud native. The reason for this is the agility that is demanded by the future state requires everything to be software enabled. You cannot actually have appliances brought in. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, so like I'll just let it go. And on the other hand, who are the beneficiaries of 5G? Like, these are just some of the representative industries, but I think it's going to touch all industries in some form or the other, because it's more and more becoming a connected world. Okay, so go to the next one very slowly. All right, here we are. So what are the benefits, right? So you are able to provision a network, a semblance of a network based on intent, right? So you have a certain outcome that you desire, and there are certain characteristics and traits that define that outcome, and you measure it a certain way, and you can now provision the network solely for that purpose. And the reason is because of the extensive amount of bandwidth available, you can slice it down to satisfy various use cases, but each of these use cases don't need to share the characteristics and load of the other use cases, and rather they can actually have their own. You can do this with private network, but not everybody is Lufthansa or Boeing or Daimler that you can afford your own spectrum and the initial installation cost. So majority of the folks are going to use the public networks, and when you're using public networks, you can avoid the upfront cost. But the key part is each of these slices that are good for a use case is an isolation, right? So when you're actually having a slice isolation, your network is isolated, your failures are isolated, and any security breaches, technically, if done well, there should be very, very minimal security breaches. But if one does creep through, it's isolated to that particular slice, and it doesn't affect the others in the mix, right? So, but once you have a slice, how do you measure? What do you measure? And how do you charge for that, right? So do you go with, like Ria mentioned, there are so many business models that could be happening around this that, do you actually charge it by some KPI that's meaningful for the customer, and don't worry about how your network is looking like or what internal KPIs you measure for, quality of service assurance and things like that? Or do you actually go step by step? It could be any combination of these, but if you look at 3GPP R16, it actually has introduced many functions around or charging triggers around this, and we'll just see that in a few slides. And the policies need to be dynamic, right? So when you're actually charging at this fine-grained model, and you have to be making it secure, your quality of service has to be maintained. Then your policies need to be dynamic as well, like, because things could be moving, things could be getting upgraded, updated, new rights could be given. So in all those cases, these policies cannot be static. They need to be dynamic and dynamically updatable. And then slice security comes into play, like, charging and policy is there, but your security cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be intertwined with all of the rest of the day-to-day operations of the slice, or minute-to-minute operations of the slice. Okay, so some of the enhancements that are done in R16, the release 16 of the specifications, are indicative of the focus on network slicing, right? So end-to-end service-based architecture, and addition of new network functions like NWDAF, like network data analytics function. These are all indicative of the focus on network slicing and the industrial and enterprise customers and IoT being a primary recipient of the benefits of 5G. Okay? And network automation enhancements, redundancy to enable URLLC. Like I think one of the key things when you think about it is like, okay, I've provisioned the slice. Now, what if something actually fails? You need to continue to provide that slice, because that breaking any component in the chain is essentially a completely broken chain, right? So you need to have that redundancy of every single network function in the chain end to end, and be able to flip over without degradation of service. Yeah. Then flexible deployment of SMS and user plane functions. The reason for this is that you can stand up, tear down, or update independently any of these functions, and the session management needs to be on point, and the user plane functions need to be there too. So, being able to deploy multiple versions of it and deploy updates of it at any point of time, that flexible deployment model needs to be there. Now, service enabler architecture layer, like I came across this as an acronym, like SEAL. But at the end of the day, like, you have various network functions deployed as services, and you need to have the service mesh, like, not to be confused with ECDO, like, and cloud native service mesh, but services talking to each other, and how do you orchestrate, like, what flow it actually takes, that needs to be in place. And last but not least is the wireless wireline, right? So this has so many implications on what's going to happen. Like it's not just wireless that's going to be part of network slice. You can go from on-prem to mobile seamlessly and be able to converge this experience of handover from wireless to wireline and back, and be able to charge at any point. Like these are all enhancements that are tremendously going to help the cause of network slicing. Oh, let me go back one more. Some of the charging triggers. So when you look at charging, like, this is some of the examples that I feel like are pertinent to the slicing. The network exposure layer charging, or AMF charging, access management, a new device registering, connection management, and location reporting, and all of these things are actually basically active things that happen to items like UE or CPE, like, that's connected to the network slice, right? So you can charge on a finer grain basis. And the slice itself, just managing the slice, like allocation, modification, deallocation of resources, these could be trigger points to say, like, okay, now that forms a session, and I want to charge for that session based on certain agreed upon terms. On the other hand, you could actually go with the QoS analytics, provide like an API for the analytics of the network for the customer to be able to see. So there's multiple layers of taking this network data and actually using that for analysis and being able to charge against that. And access traffic steering, right? So which slice does it go to, which, within the slice, like what is the guaranteed performance for certain endpoint to endpoint connectivity, right? So a single slice doesn't need to have like one single SLA, but within the slice, you can actually have multiple devices, and those devices could have individual SLAs. So your policy management is now not only just dynamic, but real time, because every communication, you could have actually updated the policies at any given point. So now, this is beautiful world. Like, oh my God, like this is like watching that movie. I don't know, I don't remember, like the Tom Cruise movie, like where they move everything with hands. Like, but there are challenges before we can get there. And what are those challenges? Right. So traditional first thing is like 100% ensuring that your network core and all the network functions are softwareized, so to speak, and cloud native, right? So that's a key capability that you need to make sure that's in place, because that's how you're actually going to ensure that your components are scalable, agile, and performant. The monolithic architectures, I still see some of the BSS vendors actually have monolithic backgrounds, and there's a little bit of a scalability problems there, right? So then you have traditional data fabrics where like you have a composite architecture that actually brings a variety of capabilities together, and it satisfies the functional need, but it does not satisfy the performance need. So, just because it's multi-tier technology, and when you have multi-tier, there's a ton of communication happening between these layers, and that basically means that every time you're going back and forth, there's a lot of things that are happening that prevent you from supporting your latency SLAs. And your security cannot be an afterthought. Like it cannot be like, oh, let me just install this other thing, and it's going to just siphon data off and then look at security events. So that's it's like a posthumous analysis. Like the event has already happened, the breach has already happened. The security constraints need to be rather an integral part of your day-to-day operations. So when things are happening, you're actually able to see what's about to manifest and then take preventative action, right? So then if your policies are dynamic, these policies would actually need to be modified dynamically based on evolving set of criteria. That means that you're actually looking at data today, right now, happening within your network, and your machine learning models are telling you what is happening and what you need to observe for, and those need to be brought back into your dynamic policies layer. And this is because BSS and charging is about charging in money. Your consistency requirements are very, very high, right? Like, so you have to pick technology components or a single platform technology that essentially ensures that you don't need to compromise on one for the other. Your scale, low latency, consistency, resiliency, redundancy, all of these need to be all there, right? So if one of them is missing, then there's a compromise, and that would actually manifest itself in some form of challenge later on, right? So let's actually quickly look at how a traditional system would look like. So when you look at the data is getting generated, it needs to be moved from the generation point to some consumption point, and the consumption point could be your data lake, analytics, or dashboards, or whatever, but in between that, you have this small layer of contextual decision intelligence, and that's what's going to drive your ability to maintain the relevance and performance of your network slices. And that's where there are four key capabilities that come together to play a role, right? So your incoming data processing, incoming data storage, application of business rules, and dynamic aggregation for measuring your KPI. So you're actually understanding your performance metrics KPI or your charging metrics KPI, and be able to use that in your processing, the data processing. But this traditional architecture of assembled or composite architecture of components put together has some inherent challenges. And we talked about latency, but also because each layer is receiving data at various points in time, you have a certain consistency challenge as well, because what you're aggregating is not what you're processing. That means you have to wait, and anytime you wait, your latency takes a hit as well, right? So any failures, how do you ensure that the business continuity is maintained? That's a problem. Incompatibility between these layers, you're stymied to stay within a certain version block, so to speak, because any of these you upgrade or update, then there's a risk that it's not compatible with the other layers anymore. But more and more, this is an evolving trend, is a lot of the core functions are also getting distributed to the edge. And when you're actually getting to the edge, and even in network slices, like when you think of it, your billing could not be centralized, and actually it could be on-prem, on slice, or by nearer to the slice consumption point. And this means that your footprint is reducing. In fact, like we're working with one of the chip manufacturers that are making hardware for edge, and this footprint reduction is a real thing, right? So when you have decreased footprint, multiple layers, and they all need to be resilient and redundant, they're conflicting interests at that point. So what does Volt do for that, right? So we have, because I'm from Volt, and what do we bring to the table? And we bring in all these capabilities together, from ingestion to action, the entire chain of activities. We bring them all together into a single resilient technology. I don't want to go too deep into this in this conversation. This is just an introduction. If anybody is interested in learning more, then please feel free to reach out to us, and we can discuss more about your needs and see how we can help or not. But we integrate with various technologies, but the key contextual decision intelligence to ensure your network slices, KPIs, quality of service are all maintained. You need to do it fast, and we built a platform that enables you to do that within milliseconds, single-digit milliseconds. So without further ado, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ria and Dalia, so we can go into questions and see how we can discuss your needs.
Thanks very much, Dheeraj, and belated thanks to Ria for two really strong presentations. I like, Ria, how you teed up, more of the overview of network slicing, then Dheeraj went into more of the details on the technology enablers. So that's great. So we already have a few questions that have been submitted in advance of the webinar, so we can start to go through those. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are still looking for any live questions. I can see ones come in, which I will put forward to the group in a moment. But let's go to those pre-submitted questions first. So I think the first one I wanted to gauge was with you, Patrick. So thanks for joining us. And the first question is, when do we envision network slicing to be available in a kind of production environment? There's a few questions off the back of it, but let's start with that as a general overview first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Great. So, the availability of slicing will vary country to country, evidently, and it's likely dependent on how quickly given operators can deploy 5G, and within 5G deploy standalone 5G deployments. And this is because standalone 5G cores are much more scalable than non-standalone. All functions are virtualized, and that allows you to have that transparency right across the network. In terms of actually getting to that point of launching a standalone a network and then therefore enabling network slicing, there are kind of three key factors that I think I would call out. So there's the regulation piece, the operators' technological readiness, and their people readiness. So from a regulation perspective, if spectrum is not available in that country yet, the 5G auction, spectrum auctions haven't yet happened, evidently an operator cannot start standing up its program in earnest. It might be able to do proof of concepts before the full release of spectrum, but that obviously will hinder progress to a full commercial deployment of 5G standalone. And then you need to look at the technological readiness as well of the organization, as I mentioned. So the existing legacy systems that you might have seen from 3G or 4G must really be replaced by those open, transparent, scalable technologies that can help you as an operator to maintain that data consistency. And then there's the people element, which I think shouldn't be underestimated. Operators should look to have cross-functional agile teams that work not just with the combination of the kind of CTIO teams and the kind of CTO teams, but also working with the product teams to make sure that they understand, what are the requirements that are out there in the market, and how can they therefore satisfy them from a tech perspective. I guess this can be supplemented either by hiring new people with the expertise in 5G. Obviously, it's a growing, fairly new area, or actually retraining of the existing workforce.
That's interesting. An interesting, I guess, framework to think about how you go, what you think as the dependencies for enabling network slicing in a production environment. One of the things you mentioned, Patrick, was around kind of 5G spectrum availability and the technology associated with building 5G. And that sort of lends me to a question that's come in, which I think you were going to pick up, Ria, around can network slicing work in LTE or 4G networks, or do they only really work in 5G networks?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that, we've been describing this sort of dynamic slicing with, end-to-end virtualized networks, so as in my presentation, that's, very much a sort of 5G standalone concept because, it is cloud native and therefore has the flexibility to support this kind of solution. But obviously, as we've, said multiple times now, it's very nascent and, not going to be a fully fledged solution for at least a few more years. And so, there are sort of tests and proof of concepts being done over 4G, but that is more sort of a basic isolation of a service over common infrastructure, where 5G slicing is more about tailoring the network and really customizing it to meet the specific quality of service demands of individual services or specific customers. But I know, for example, Deutsche Telekom have done a sort of simplified network slice implementation over 4G for a manufacturer, and I think the over LTE, but the intention is to ultimately move that over into being this sort of 5G network slicing that we've defined.
Yeah, and maybe just on that, so there are just a couple of comments, just a little bit around sort of Volt's position. So one is just saying, if you look at today's, I think it's private PLT, private LTE network architectures, excuse me, how do you envision Volt integrating? So a little bit of, the LTE version of some of the things we've been talking about. Where does Volt fit in?
So with 4G, one of the things that you can actually see is the APN access point naming, and it was actually a little bit there, but it's more like a static network slicing, right? So once you enter the world of dynamic changes and need to be able to do that on the fly without any system downtime, because downtime basically breaks all SLAs at that point, right? So that's where actually Volt has a very, very strong suit, because you can think of it as bringing database and processing together to ensure that you're actually processing the data meaningfully, complemented and supplemented with machine learning intelligence, right? So this is the whole picture. Like, you cannot take one or the other and say like, okay, I'm going to just do this and not that, and that's actually going to not complete the picture. And that's where Volt has a strong role to bring these together to meaningfully make recommendations or even automate the decisions and actions according to where you are in the journey of maturation, so to speak.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And a little, maybe another one for you that's coming through the live audience, slightly outside of looking at the network specifically, but it's a bit around some of the enabling platforms and systems around that. And one audience member said, in such a complex billing/charging model and environment, how will revenue assurance work or billing disputes be resolved?
I can take that because I actually work with customers within Volt's ecosystem that are in the BSS side and the RA side. The key is having that comprehensive picture of what's happening, right? So being able to scale to a model where you're actually able to get the CDRs or network interfaces, interface requests, and being able to collect all of the data really, really fast, and being able to use some rules that are, baseline and then dynamically modified by what you're observing from, think of like a SymBox kind of a scenario, right? Like, it's kind of primitive fraud at this point, but it's still prevalent in several countries. And, and these SymBoxes are now also using like VPNs and being able to go through various network routes. So you're not really able to say like, okay, is this coming from one particular location? But you can develop that intelligence, develop the context change of a set of SIMs changing location instantaneously, right? So that kind of information, you bring it all together with your charging points and charging triggers and be able to complete the picture. Now, the part about this was a small part at the end which really made me very keen about this. The billing disputes. So this is a key part, right? So, and this is where even if your network is intent-based and you're measuring to the KPI of the outcomes, you still need to have the audit information behind it. And that's where your ability to capture the data and measure the internal KPIs that support the outcome KPIs for the customer is really important to show that drill down to show whether there's a dispute or not. And if there's a dispute, what is the evidence-based argument from, or settlement, I suppose, is a peaceful term instead of argument. So that's really key, right? So at the end of the day, in a software-enabled, end-to-end software-enabled network, your data is everything, right? So it's the truth, it's your mantra, it's your soul of the system, so to speak. So what do you do with that? And that's going to be key. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and sorry for going a bit off script, but it did make me think of another question, which is just, it sounds like this ability to be aware of what's happening across your network and different systems and platforms is key, and having that data exposed. Well, how close are we, would you say, as an industry to that? Is it can you do it with legacy? Is there a way to kind of overlay what's there in existing legacy systems? Is it really about changing that into cloud native platforms that will bring that to life?
It's not uncommon for people to take that approach, right? So we're actually working with a couple of customers that took that approach. One of the challenges that you would see is that the legacy could be performant up to a certain scale or up to a certain volume, so to speak, right? So beyond that, you start using, this nail is really, really big. I can't actually hit it with this hammer. So let me take multiple hammers and actually hit it instead of actually picking the right tool to do, right? So you see these abnormal measures that get taken to ensure that the system stays intact while hopefully perform. And I forget, there's a term, Germans have words for everything, and there's one word that actually stands where you do a lot of work in the hope of making it better, but actually you end up at a place much worse than where you started. And that's what actually happens. So it's not irreparable, right? So at the end of the day, you need to repair it. And that's the challenge that you need to watch out for if you're trying to take your traditional architecture and retrofit it, or jerry rig it, so to speak. You are probably going to end up in deep soup at some point, actually. So.
Okay, so good warning there. So I want to just switch the conversation a bit to customer views and the actual enterprises who are poised to use the benefits of slicing. And maybe Rhea, start off with you. So again, this question came in before the webinar, but looking at the enterprise view and trying to understand how aware are enterprises of the slicing technology and its benefits, and which use cases seem more important to them?
Yeah, in terms of how aware enterprises are, I think there definitely will be benefits for operators in, educating enterprises on what slicing can actually enable. So, in terms of being able to meet the requirements of some of these more advanced and, especially, I guess, mission critical use cases, and also how slicing fits into, the private networking portfolio as well. But I think just the other thing is it's also important that operators, think about, and this is something that Dheeraj kind of touched upon, but how enterprises are thinking about slicing in terms of their sort of concerns around security. So, I know that when we've spoken to enterprises in the past about slicing, one of the things that really came out is that, they have a lot of concerns, I guess, because it is, slices using a common infrastructure. There are a lot of concerns around either actual, security breaches, or just the fact that, you could have sort of non-malicious failures that could cause disruption. And, even the fact that you could have maybe a slice that is a bit more resource intensive and, maybe would take some capacity away from other slices. So I think it's almost that, there needs to be a bit of educating on what it can enable, but also sort of alleviating some of those concerns as well that will sort of help to have more kind of productive conversations with enterprises.
Okay. So
I
I mean,
have a couple of thoughts to add to that. Just
yeah.
as a commentary, like, of course you can shoot me down if you think I'm mistaken, but when one of the things that I actually see is anytime there's a concept or there's a situation where they say like sky is the limit, they say like, yes, sky is the limit, but ground is somewhere I could stand too, like, and nothing changes, right? Like, so it's like, what do we do? Like, oh my god, like all of these capabilities, and what do we do? Like, and then you just go into this like soul searching analysis paralysis mode, and you just basically end up doing nothing. And my suggestion is to like pick a segment of your business process that would benefit from isolated capabilities, right? So just start on the journey. Just do something. Maybe start with the low risk part of your business processes, and but evolve from there. And you would actually start seeing what is the sky is the limit meaning, right? Like, so, and then you would be able to just evolve step by step into a comfort level where you would be able to think of this as doable. Old age, I forgot the second bit. Anyway, so I'll come back to it.
But and just to clarify, so when you say you, do you mean the enterprises or the telecoms operators?
I'm talking about the enterprises because I'm working with a few of those, and it's this the quest for I need to build only the killer app, and it's like, no, there's no killer app right now. The killer app will show up when you get on the path, right? So and it needs to be recognized, and actually the first step needs to be taken, so you can recognize it at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think like some enterprises we've spoken to have sometimes tried to find, a small part of their, almost a sweet spot, is a small part of their business, which is relatively standalone, but has a big impact, which is, maybe an idealistic, but, equally, like you're saying, in other cases, it might be difficult to get to that sweet spot. And so finding something that is isolated, and makes some impact is the first step. And then you can think about the blue sky, once you've kind of got over that hump. Okay. That's interesting. I just wondering, what kind of, are there enterprises in specific sectors that you're seeing now or you're hearing that from?
Usually these are either manufacturers or brick and mortar, and they basically feel like I need it all like that, right? So, and that's the problem.
Okay. Yeah, just wondering. That's cool. So on a slightly different note, looking at maybe another sector of the market. So one of the audience submitted a question which was saying they wanted to know about the potential of network slicing in the domain of residential and small business and the small business market. Will it be possible to provide something like a slice as an umbrella for customers' devices by separating them from others? Yeah, I think, Patrick, you were going to pick this one up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, absolutely, there is certainly benefit for consumers and small businesses alike for network slicing. It is coming. In terms of the timelines, we talked about widespread network slicing being perhaps 2-3 years in the future. Most likely, and Dheeraj, Ria, Dalia, my view is that most likely we'll see that it's kind of the large enterprises catered to first, because I think the value there is most obvious. I think it's easiest to try and address some of those needs. So it's kind of a big win first. But certainly after you see kind of large enterprises getting the value, certainly that will trickle down to smaller businesses and certainly the residential market. If we talk about consumers, for example, Ria had mentioned Deutsche Telekom already doing kind of 4G network slicing for a manufacturing customer. Well, they've worked with Ericsson and Samsung in a lab trial to create a network slice for gaming with a dedicated quality of service and policy rules running over that particular network slice. So absolutely, there are use cases, whether it's gaming or even for smart home devices, could be anything like even home security devices, having them on a slice. So, smoke alarms, alarm systems, that kind of thing. So absolutely, there is certainly value, but in terms of when that will land, it'll probably be a bit after the large enterprise market get their share of the pie.
It's funny that right before this webinar, actually, I was chatting with a colleague of mine, David Rolfe, a brilliant guy out of Dublin, and this exact scenario was what he was actually mentioning. Like it dawned on him, if he was driving through an area and he caught this mythical unicorn called 4 bars 5G, right? So, and he's like, oh my God, like let me just do a Ookla check on that, and he had like almost 900 megabits per second speed on his mobile phone, and it's like, okay, if I can actually have like 15 people in a small business be able to connect to a slice, and now and defined by a radius, for example, then that means that I don't have people from random infiltrating countries trying to get into my network to take advantage, but I can actually set policies and rules in place that I can govern this small geographic location, which would thwart a lot of the security issues that you would be typically coming across in, an RJ45 Ethernet cable type of networking. So we were just going back and forth. Like he came up with this idea, and I thought, like, wow, that's really interesting. So we'll see, where that goes. So.
Yeah, and I guess it's a bit of, quite an early stage now, but once it comes out and you see real commercial models, it becomes more interesting. I mean, I think generally what we've been hearing as well is that the kind of private network or dedicated campus networks is getting picked up by large enterprises, but the network slicing model would be potentially even more compelling for smaller enterprises who don't need that level of control, still want the ability to prioritize certain traffic or applications, or need the security benefits, but can't pay for a private network and also manage it maybe in the same way. So yeah, some differences there. And I guess the other thing maybe to consider is the fact that smaller enterprises not all, but if you have many small enterprises in urban location, there is also potentially a lack of spectrum. Like if you're doing a truly private network approach where everyone gets their own spectrum, that's a finite resource. So that I think is also a bit of an inhibitor for adoption there on private networks for smaller enterprises, which I've heard recently. The other thing that's come up is, so we've talked about technology, talked about a little bit use cases, the enterprise demand side. This one is a bit more on who's providing, I guess, network slicing. And one question that came in is, are there any models where non-mobile operator entities could provide slicing, for example, systems integrators or vendors using industrial spectrum? I think, Patrick, you were going to start us off, but as always, Dheeraj, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the main provider that we would see of network slicing would be kind of the established mobile network operators. But in some geographic locations, there will be an ability for an offer for network slicing offered outside of those mobile network operators. That's really, like I say, country dependent and most likely kind of regulation dependent. So we've seen in countries like Germany, for example, spectrum being allocated for industrial use cases, for example. You could see a system integrator getting involved there, acquiring some spectrum and creating some slices for one particular customer or a set of customers, depending on how private those end customers wanted their data to be and how separate they wanted it to be. So absolutely, there is scope for that.
I have no thoughts. I didn't even think this actually, so I'm going to just not say anything.
No, that's all good. Okay, well then maybe I know we've only got a minute before we have to wrap up, but I think the last question, because this one was specific to you, Dheeraj, someone just talked a little bit around vendors promoting dynamic orchestration for end-to-end 5G network slicing. I know we talked a bit about that even in our paper. And so the audience member is asking, how big a telco's pain point is orchestration in your view? In a 30-second answer, basically.
Oh, okay. Can I borrow some time? So I don't know how big it is because there is a different places in the maturity model, right? Like, so the ones that are most mature actually understand that it is quite a complex problem, and the dynamism is really what's contributing to the magnitude of the problem, right? So if static, then it's not a problem because you just define once and you're done. But it's the dynamic nature of the evolving requirements and SLAs and guarantees that's going to really pose a problem. That's the 30-second answer, like that you're looking for. The question was how big a problem, and it's a problem.
Yeah, fairly big problem. Okay, good to hear. Well, thanks for a brief but succinct answer there, and thanks everyone for answering everyone's questions. I know we didn't get through all the questions. There were some really juicy ones on things like network slicing over fixed mobile, converged networks, a little bit on, like Open RAN and how that's going to impact network slicing. So there'll be some good ones to tuck into offline when we go through those questions, and we'll share those answers around afterwards. And as a reminder, we'll be sharing the slides and the recording of the webinar afterwards too. So final thing is just to say thank you to everyone who joined the webinar today, and hopefully to, I guess, speak to you indirectly soon if we do another webinar, and also to see any of you at Mobile Congress because the STL Partners team will be there.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And actually, if anyone has any questions, you guys could reach out to any of us for discussion, further discussion.
Sure.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.